Really good. So we're still in July, although it feels like we maybe should be in August, and we're still talking about step 7, humbly ask Him to remove our shortcomings. And we've really beat this step up through June and July with doing steps 6 and 7, and we always talk about them being companion steps. We need to kind of work them together. So when we kind of discover that we have a defect of character or a shortcoming, then we immediately ask that it be removed. So working them together, they seem to work out. It seems to work out. But I find when we ask for a defect to be removed, then we need to replace it with something positive. So if we're removing it, there's a void or an empty space. We need to put something back in there. It came to my attention after a message I did, I think it was in June, and where we talked about figuring out the positive actions to replace the negative ones, that some people were somewhat confused about that or were having trouble figuring it out. So we're going to just go over that a little bit, and we'll review a positive action to replace fear would be possibly courage or faith. And faith that we'll have the courage to work through those fears. A resentment might be forgiveness, maybe love, tolerance, patience. So we ask that the resentments be removed and ask God to help us replace that with love or tolerance, help us become a more tolerant person. Pride and ego would be replaced with humility. Sex and sexual kind of stuff with maybe wisdom. Selfishness with giving back or sharing. Dishonesty, obviously, would be honesty. Vengeful, maybe loving. False pride would possibly be modesty or humility. So we can always find a positive to replace the negative, and we need to do that. The list goes on, but the important thing is that we recognize a defective character and then take action to have it removed and replace it with a positive one. This is not an exact science, but it works for me if we work at it. The work takes place each and every day, and as the defect comes to light, we take action. And some days we have to repeat that action, and the next day that defect may come back again and we have to repeat it again. But if we continue to be vigilant about it and we work on it day after day, those defects will diminish and remove. Of all the defects of character that come to light, the biggest, I suppose, or at least the one that underlies all the other defects of character, is fear. And fear is a huge obstacle to our recovery. The Big Book says that resentments are the #1 cause of relapse, and I think I believe that. Bill W. and Dr. Bob knew what they were talking about when they wrote the Big Book, but it comes to mind they might agree that fear is the next biggest cause. Some people might disagree and say that ego is a pretty big cause of relapse, and they might be right. However, my experience with ego is that for most people that have huge egos, it's a mask covering up some other defects of character, one of which might be fear. Ego sometimes portrays that folks with ego feel that they're much better than the rest of us. In reality, from my experience, that's a mask for the fear that they aren't quite good enough as the rest of us. Low self-esteem seems to be a common problem amongst addicts and alcoholics. Fear is at the bottom of most expressions of our character defects. Fear blocks connections with others and our spiritual growth. We know that spirituality is the one main and only solution to our addictions. So the definition of fear in the Webster's dictionary is the emotional response to a perceived danger. The most imminent the danger, the greater and the more fierce that fear might be. Understanding fear is important. Some fear protects us from real danger. The sound of cracking ice when we're walking on a frozen pond might indicate that there's danger afoot. The hair rising up on the back of our neck when we're walking down a back alley late night in Calgary might indicate there's some danger afoot. The sense of heat as we get closer to a fire or to a hot stove, it warns us of the danger afoot. There are other fears that keep us from moving forward. For many of us in recovery, we hear ice cracking when we're standing in the middle of a desert. So we don't have to be anywhere near the water, and we hear that ice cracking and the fear comes along. We may be experiencing fear when we're not in any real danger. This may well signify our discomfort with making healthy changes. It tells us we're right where we should be, and we need to learn to press on. Even though we're experiencing the fear, we need to have courage to move through it. Remember, on the other side of fear is the land of all those promises that are in the big book. All the promises in the big book start coming true as we work through our fears and we work our program and we work our steps. To do this, we must stay connected. In many cases, our connections with others is exactly what we're afraid of. Many of us have found that these connections can be very dangerous, and for good reason. Nothing hurts more than when we reach out for a hand or some support to receive messages that harm us or harm our spirit, or a cold shoulder from some other message to lessen our self-worth. This is bad enough for adults, but as children and teens, it's life-threatening to our self-esteem. Either in early life or in adulthood, most everyone with active addiction comes into recovery with fear of intimacy. The fear is behind our avoidance of honesty, trust, closeness, and connection. Add to this the effects of our childhood abuse and or any mental health issues, dual diagnosis issues. Gathering the courage to reach out to others becomes just that much more difficult. It's hard for us to do that. As difficult as it may be, this is a journey that can and must be made. We need to do what we fear the most. We must strive for what eludes us in the past, or what eluded us in the past, is honesty, trust, commitment, caring, and responsibility. As addicts and alcoholics, we are the masters of slipping around the most dangerous corners and missing them. Here's the insanity of our disease. The same person that is absolutely terrified of the dangers of fellowship will run like a sprinter back to the situations that stole every speck of what makes his life worthwhile. We'll go back into what we knew, no matter how bad it was for us and no matter how much it stole from us. How often do we see that happen? Here are some typical ways that we run from fear: withdrawal, isolation, eating too much, blaming other people, spending too much money, working to exhaustion, fighting with other people, switching addictions, and not the last, but the obvious one, is relapse and using again. So rather than immediate reaction to fear, we must learn new ways to work through our fears and deal with them. It's not easy to stand in the face of fear. In order to do that, we have to understand that we need to work through our fears to get to the other side. Will it be easy? No, not at all, but it certainly will be worth it if you work at it. We need to open up to ourselves, to our sponsor, to a mentor, to our home groups, and we need to be honest. We need to own the damage that we've done to ourselves and to other people. We need to ask for forgiveness, and we need to make amends. This is what we're taught in the big book. We need to get rid of our selfish self-centeredness, and we need to do service to others. None of this is easy, but I believe there is no task that willing human beings in connection with their higher power and the fellowship can't accomplish. Remember, there is nothing stronger than a spiritually fortified and connected human being. So how are we going to do the work, and how are we going to work through our fears? There's 4 little points here. One is pray, and we talk about that all the time around here, is pray. When in doubt, pray. Prayer works, and we know it works, so ask for help to work through your fears. Next one would be sit at your table with your fear, look your fear in the face, reflect on it, what you're afraid of and why, then write a letter to your fear telling it just who you are now and what you're planning on doing. You're going to deal, and how you're going to deal with that fear in the future. Set out your guidelines for handling your fears. Then, as always, discuss with a trusted friend, your sponsor, a mentor, just how that worked for you. And then write out what you learned from this. What was the lesson that you took from all of this? And keep those journalings and those writings handy, because in the future, when it happens again, you can go back and review it. And you can use the same concept with most every fear that you want to work through, but you need to face it. I know Brad talks about feelings and sitting in your feelings to get an understanding of what the gift comes from those. And this is the same idea. If you sit in your fear and try to understand it, the wisdom and the choices will come to you on how to solve it. I want to segue from here into forgiveness, which is something we're sometimes very fearful of doing or just plain resistant to doing for many reasons. The scripture I've chosen this evening is a simple one that really talks about forgiveness. It's Mark 11, verse 25, and it says this: "But when you are praying, first forgive anyone you are holding a grudge against, so that your Father in heaven will forgive your sins too." That was Jesus talking to his disciples and talking about having faith in God, in your higher power. He says, if you believe, all things are possible. Then he goes on to say, forgive those who are holding a grudge against you, and you too will be forgiven. What's the definition of forgiveness? To cease to feel resentment against another on account of a wrong committed. So it makes sense. And we've talked about this just recently, that the opposite of forgiveness would be resentment, or the opposite of resentment is forgiveness. The dictionary's definition of resentment is anger and ill will in view of real or fancied wrongs. I like to call those perceived wrongs. Those real or perceived wrongs may have happened years ago, and the perpetrator of the wrong may not even recall ever having done that, maybe not recall the event whatsoever, yet we carry all the anger, all the resentment, all the blame for all those years, and it eats us up and eats away at us. What does this take to remove the resentments and the anger? Moving to a point that we can forgive that person. That's what it takes. We need to get to the point that we can forgive. The solution is easier than you might think. The timing might be different for everyone. When we do this, we feel a peace of mind like no other, and feel really good as we leave room filled to fill ourselves with positive things such as love. An example that Alice Wheaton used in her book, The Forgiveness Prescription, is this, and it was quite good, I thought. Imagine your heart as a 10-gallon container. It can hold 10 gallons of emotions. When resentments, anger, and fear take up 8 gallons, there's only room for about 2 gallons of love. This leads to a diminished life if we hang on to all of these fears and all the resentments, hurts, and anger. If we get rid of the resentments, the fear, and the anger, we leave room to fill ourselves with lots of love, lots of forgiveness, lots of God's grace, and we can move forward in our spiritual journey as our Creator really wanted us to. Reflecting on your life and your attitudes, do you wonder if there is room in your heart to forgive those that had done you wrong recently and long time ago? We often say hanging on to resentments is like us drinking poison, hoping that the other person dies. Doesn't make much sense to me. There's 4 kinds of forgiveness. We'll just chat about them for a minute. 1 is seeking God's forgiveness. 2 is forgiving others. 3 is forgiving yourself. And 4 is seeking the forgiveness of others. The first 3 forms of forgiveness are done on your own through prayer, meditation, maybe some journaling and reflecting on the situations. The third involves becoming vulnerable and going public. Rejection and uncomfortable feelings associated with these are very real, but sometimes we must work through that. Oh yes, the other thing that comes here is the fear of rejection, and how many of us go through that fear almost every day. Oh, I'm afraid they're not going to like me. I'm afraid things aren't going to go well with them. We must forgive and we must forget. And some of you will say, forgiving is easy, but I can't forget. I suggest to you that unless and until you're ready to forget, the anger and resentment will come and keep you in your unhappy state forever and ever. To forgive and forget does not mean in any way that you condone the behaviors that you're forgiving. Remember why you're forgiving others. It's for your well-being, not theirs. It's for your spiritual growth, and it's so we can fill our hearts with all the love and happiness that we really truly deserve. We must forgive, as there is no other way of feeling that deep peace that comes from the strength of our core. If we can't rebuild our core, we are destined to feel discord in all areas of our life. Let's take this little challenge. Let's try to have at least 1% forgiveness. That's not very much. 1% forgiveness to each and every person that stimulates fear, anger, and resentment in you. 1% doesn't sound like a big goal, and it should be attainable if we work at it. When we take this stand, we take on life on life's terms instead of trying to control the people, events, and the circumstances over which we have no control. 1% seems like a small shift, but it is. But let me assure you, again, if we make an effort, your life will have quantum positive results experienced from your peace of mind. As we go through the process, do we have the opportunity to get rid of many of our shortcomings and defects of character? Remember, forgiveness is the answer. Forgiving others and forgiving ourselves releases us of the bondage of guilt, shame, and allows us to be filled with God's love and God's grace.